The Legends of Langaffer by Alfred H Miles. Langaffer was but a village in those days, with a brook running through it, a bridge, a marketplace, a score of houses, and a church. It may have become a city since, and may have changed its name. We cannot tell. All we know is that the curious things we are about to relate took place a long time ago, before there was any mention of railroads or gas lamps or any of the modern inventions people have nowadays. There was one cottage quite in the middle of the village, much smaller, cleaner, and neater than its neighbors. The little couple who lived in it were known over the country, far and wide, as Watty and Matty, the tiny folk of Langaffer. These two had gone and got married, if you please, when they were quite young, without asking anybody's advice or permission, whereupon their 4 parents and their 8 grandparents sternly disowned them, and the fairy of the land, highly displeased, declared the two should remain tiny, as a punishment for their folly. Yet they loved one another very tenderly, Watty and Matty, and as the years rolled by, and never a harsh word was heard between them, and peace and unity reigned in their diminutive household, which could not always have been said of their parents' and grandparents' firesides, why then the neighbors began to remark that they were a good little couple, and the fairy of the land declared that if they could but distinguish themselves in some way or perform some great action, they might be allowed to grow up after all. "But how could we ever do a great deed?" said Watty to Matty, laughing. "Look at the size of us. I defy any man in the village, with an arm only the length of mine, to do more than I. Of course I can't measure myself with the neighbors. To handle Farmer Fairweather's pitchfork would break my back, and to hook a great perch, like Miller Mealy in the mill race, might be the capsizing of me. Still, what does that matter? I can catch little sprats for my little wife's dinner. I can dig in our patch of garden and mend our tiny roof, so that we live as cosily and as merrily as the best of them." "To be sure, Watty dear," said Matty, "and what would become of poor me supposing thou wert any bigger? As it is, I can bake the little loaves thou lovest to eat, and I can spin and knit enough for us both. But oh dear, wert thou the size of Farmer Fairweather or Miller Mealy, my heart would break." In truth, the little couple had made many attempts at pushing their fortune in the village, and had failed, because it was no easy problem to find a trade to suit poor Watty. A friendly cobbler had taught him how to make boots and shoes, knew soling and mending, and he once had the courage to suspend over his door the sign of a shoemaker's shop. Then the good wives of Langaffer did really give him orders for tiny slippers for their little ones to toddle about in. But alas, ere the work was completed and sent home, the little feet had got time to trot about a good deal, and had far outgrown the brand-new shoes, and poor Watty acquired the character of a tardy tradesman. So shoemaking won't do. He had said to Matty, "If only the other folk would remain as little as we are." In spite of this, Watty and Matty not only continued to be liked by their neighbors, but in time grew to be highly respected by all who knew them. Watty could talk a great deal, and could give a reason for everything, and his dwarf figure might be seen of an evening sitting on the edge of the bridge wall, surrounded by a group of village worthies, whilst his shrill little voice rose high above theirs, discussing the affairs of Langaffer. And little Matty was the very echo of little Watty. What he said she repeated on his authority in many a half-hour's gossip with the good wives by the village well. Now it happened that one day the homely community of Langaffer was startled by sudden and alarming tidings. A traveler, hastening on foot through the village, asked the first person he met, "What news of the war?" "What war?" returned the simple peasant in some surprise. "Why, have you really heard nothing of the great armies marching about all over the country, attacking, besieging and fighting in pitched battles, the king and all his knights and soldiers against the enemies of the country? Ah, and it is not over yet, but I wonder to find all so tranquil here in the midst of such troublous times." And then the stranger passed on, and his words fell on the peaceful hamlet like a stone thrown into the bosom of a tranquil lake. At once there was a general commotion and excitement among the village folk. Could the news be true? How dreadful if the enemy were indeed to come and burn down their homesteads, and ravage their crops, and kill them every one with their swords. That night the gossip lasted a long time on Langaffer Bridge. Watty's friends, the miller and the grocer, the tailor and the shoemaker, and big farmer Fairweather spoke highly of the king and his faithful knights, and clenched their fists, and raised their voices to an angry pitch at the mention of the enemy's name. And little Watty behaved like the rest of them, strutted about, and doubled up his tiny hands, and proclaimed what he should do if Langaffer were attacked, and if he were only a little bigger, whereupon the neighbors laughed and held their sides, and cried aloud, "Well done, Watty." But the following evening brought more serious tidings. Shortly before nightfall, a rider, mounted on a sweltering steed, arrived at the village inn all out of breath, to announce that the army was advancing, and that the general of the forces called upon every householder in Langaffer to furnish food and lodging for the soldiers. "What, soldiers quartered on us?" cried the good people of Langaffer. "Who ever heard the like?" "They shall not come to my house," exclaimed Farmer Fairweather resolutely. "O neighbor Fairweather," shouted half a dozen voices, "and thou hast such barns and lofts, and such very fine stables and cowsheds, thou art the very one who canst easily harbor the soldiers." "As for me," cried the miller, "I have barely room for my meal sacks." "Oh, plenty of room," screamed the others, "and flour to make bread for the troopers and bran for the horses." "But it falls very hard on poor people like us," cried the weaver, the tinker, the cobbler and tailor, upon which little Watty raised his voice and began, "Shame on ye, good neighbors. Do ye grudge hospitality to the warriors who go forth to shed their blood in our defense? Every man who has strength of body and limb ought to feel it an honor to afford food and shelter to the army of the land." "Thy advice is cheap, Watty," cried several voices sarcastically. "Thou and thy tiny wife escape all this trouble finely, for the general would as soon dream of quartering a soldier on dwarfs as on the sparrows that live on the housetops." "And what if we are small?" retorted Watty, waxing scarlet. "We have never shirked from our duty yet, and never intend to do so." This boast of the little man's had the effect of silencing some of the most dissatisfied, and then the people of Langaffer dispersed for the night, every head being full of the morrow's preparations. Watty dear," said Mattie to her husband, when the two were retiring to sleep in their cozy little house, "we may bless ourselves this night that we are not reckoned amongst the big people, and that our cottage is so small no full-grown stranger would try to enter it." "But we must do something, Mattie dear," said Watty. "You can watch the women washing and cooking all day tomorrow, whilst I encourage the men in the marketplace and on the bridge. These are great times, Mattie." "Indeed they are, Watty dear." And so saying, the little couple fell fast asleep. The following morning Langaffer village presented a lively picture of bustle and excitement. Soldiers in gaudy uniforms, and with gay-colored banners waving in the breeze, marched in to the sound of trumpet and drum. How their spears and helmets glittered in the sunshine, and what a neighing and prancing their steeds made in the little market square. The men and women turned out to receive them, the children clapped their hands with delight, and the village geese cackled loudly to add to the stir. Watty was there looking on, with his hands in his pockets, but nobody heeded him now. They were all too busy, running here, running there, hastening to and fro, carrying longswords and shields, holding horses' heads, stamping, tramping, scolding, and jesting. Little Watty was more than once told to stand aside, and more than once got pushed about and mixed up with the throng of idle children, whose juvenile curiosity kept them spellbound, stationed near the village inn. Watty began to feel lonely in the midst of the commotion. A humiliating sense of his own weakness and uselessness crept over him, and the poor little dwarf turned away from it all and wandered out of the village, far away through the meadows and into a lonely wood. On and on he went, unconscious of the distance, till night closed in, when, heartsick and weary, he flung his little body down at the foot of a majestic oak and covered his face with his hands. He had not lain long when he was startled by a sound close at hand, a sigh much deeper than his own, and a half-suppressed moan. What could it be? In an instant Watty was on his feet, peering to right and left, trying to discover whence those signs of distress proceeded. The moon had just risen, and by her pale light he fancied he saw something glitter among the dried leaves of the forest. Cautiously little Watty crept closer, and there, to his astonishment, lay extended the form of a knight in armor. He rested on his elbow, and his head was supported by his arm, and his face, which was uncovered, wore an expression of sadness and anxiety. He gazed with an air of calm dignity rather than surprise on the dwarf, when the latter, after walking once or twice round him, cried out, noble knight, pray what is your grief, and can I do aught to relieve it? Say, wherefore these groans and sighs?" "Foes and traitors, sorrow and shame," returned the warrior. "But tell me, young man, canst thou show me the road to Langaffer?" "That I can, noble sir," answered Watty, impressed by the stranger's tone. "Do I not dwell in Langaffer myself?" "Then perhaps, young man, thou knowest the castle of Ravenspoor." "The ruined tower of Count Colin of Ravenspoor," cried Watty. "Why, that is close to Langaffer. Our village folk call it the fortress still, although wild and dismantled since the time it was forsaken by—" "Name not Count Colin to me," cried the knight impatiently. "The base traitor that left his own land to join hands with the enemy, his sable plume shall ne'er again wave in his own castle yard. But come, hasten, young man, and guide me straight to Ravenspoor. Our men, you say, are encamped at Langaffer." "That they are," returned Watty. "Well nigh every house is filled with them. They arrived in high spirits this morning, and doubtless, by this time, are sleeping as heavily as they were carousing an hour ago." "All the better," cried the knight, "for it will be a different sort of sleep some of them may have ere the morrow's setting sun glints through the stems of these forest trees. And now, let us hasten to Ravenspoor." So saying, he drew himself up to his full height, lifted his sword from the ground, and hung it on his side, and strode away with Watty, looking all the while like a great giant in company of a puny dwarf. As they emerged from the forest, Watty pointed with his finger across the plain to the village of Langaffer, and then to a hill overhanging it, crowned by a fortress which showed in the distance its chiseled outlines against the evening sky. An hour's marching across the country brought them close to the dismantled castle. The moonbeams depicted every grey stone overgrown with moss and ivy, and the rank weeds choking the apertures which once had been windows. "An abode for the bat and the owl," remarked Watty, "but brave sir, you cannot pass the night here. Pray come to my tiny house in the village, and rest there till the morning dawns." "I accept thy hospitality, young man," said the warrior, "but first thou canst render me a service. Thou art little and light. Canst clamber up to yonder stone where the raven sits, and tell me what thou beholdest far away to the west." Whereupon Watty, who was agile enough and anxious to help the stranger, began to climb up, stone by stone, the outer wall of the ruined fortress. A larger man might have felt giddy and insecure, but he, with his tiny figure, sprang from ledge to ledge so swiftly, holding firmly by the tufts of grass and the trailing ivy, that ere he had time to think of danger, he had reached the spot where, a moment before, a grim-looking raven had been keeping solemn custody. Here the stone moved, and Watty fancied he heard something rattle as he set his foot upon it. The raven had now perched herself on a yet higher eminence, on a piece of the old coping stone of the castle parapet, and she flapped her great ugly wings, and cawed and croaked, as if displeased at this intrusion on her solitude. Watty followed the ill-omened bird, and drove her away from her vantage ground, where he himself now found a better footing from which to make his observations. To the west, he cried, lights like campfires, all in a row far against the horizon. This was all he had to describe, and it seemed enough to satisfy the armed stranger. "And now, young man," he said, when Watty had, after a perilous descent, gained the castle yard once more, "I shall be thy guest for the night." A thrill of pride and pleasure stole through Watty's breast as he thought of the honor of receiving the tall warrior. But the next instant, his heart was filled with anxiety as he remembered the tiny dimensions of his home, Matty, and himself. All these hours, his little wife had passed in sore perplexity because of his absence. At the accustomed time for supper, she had spread the snow-white napkin on the stool that served them for a table. She had piled up a saucerful of beef and lentils for Watty, and filled him an egg-cupful of home-brewed ale to the brim. And yet he never came. What could ever have happened? A tiny little person like Watty might have been trampled to death in the crowd of great soldiers that now filled Langaffer. A horse's kick at the village inn might have killed him. He might have been pushed into the stream and been drowned. Oh, the horrible fancies that vaguely hovered round poor Matty's fireside. No wonder the little woman sat there with her face pale as ashes, her teeth chattering, and her tiny hands clasped tightly together. And thus Watty found her when he returned at last, bringing the stranger knight along with him. But Matty was so overjoyed to see her Watty safe home, and held her arms so tightly round his neck, that he could scarcely get his story told. Little indeed did the good people of Langaffer, that night, asleep in their beds, dream of the great doings under the modest roof of Watty and Matty. All the furniture they possessed drawn out and joined together, and covered with the whole household stock of mattresses, quilts, and blankets, to form a couch for their guests' repose. The knight had eaten all Matty's store of newly baked bread, and now only begged for a few hours' rest, and a little more water to quench his thirst when he should waken. As he took off his helmet with its great white plume and handed it to Watty, the latter staggered under its weight, and Matty cried out, "Oh, Watty, how beautiful, how noble it must be to ride o'er hill and dale in such a gallant armour." Then thrice to the ferry well in the meadow beyond the bridge of Langaffer must Watty and Matty run to fetch water, the best in the land, clear as crystal and cold as ice, for it required fully 3 times what they could carry to fill the great stone pitcher for the sleeping warrior. And the 3rd time the two came to the spring, behold, the water bubbled and flashed with the colours of the rainbow, and by the light of the moon they caught a glimpse of something bright reflected on its surface. They glanced round, and there a lovely, radiant being sat by, with a tiny phial in her hand. "Hold here, little people," she cried, "let me drop some cordial into the pitcher." "Nay, nay," screamed Matty. "Nay," cried Watty sternly, "the drink must be as pure as crystal."